The birth of my recent bike trip came after the birth of Sophie Ua Maria Bickers in Denver. Grandmother Ua Maria, known by those on the American side of the ocean as Ruka, and I went out to welcome Sophie to the world and share the joy with her parents. Sophie's first name links her to the spirit of wisdom, depicted as feminine since ancient times. Her middle name, literally daughter of Mary, links her not only to her grandmother and great-grandmother Ua Maria, but also to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who welcomed and nurtured the divine. I was not nearly as fit as Ruka for caring for a newborn, so after a few days, Ruka helped me get started on a less rigorous activity. In Christine's zippy Subaru, we went to Zapata Falls, and the Great Sand Dunes National Monument. We especially enjoyed the sand dunes, glad that we were there when we could comfortably walk barefoot on them. In summer, the surface temperature can reach 150 degrees. 9 miles long and 6 miles at their widest, dunes daily host hundreds of visitors whose movements and voices blend like worshipers in a cathedral. As choirs sing praises, so children call out as they slide on sandboards or splash in the stream along the dune's eastern edge. As acolytes carry flame to candle with bowed head, so hikers lean forward as they plod toward a chosen peak. As congregants sit still, sometimes looking toward the altar, sometimes at light through the window, the priest's words a distant hum. So some visitors sit quietly, sometimes focused on a nearby sand formation, sometimes on a snow-capped peak, wind through the sand, humming of the sublime. We stayed the night in nearby Alamosa, Colorado. The next morning, Ruka returned for more time with Sophie, Christine, and John after seeing me off. I had told Ruka I would ease into the trip, probably going only the 30 level miles to Antonito on the first day. She doubted, rightly, that I would stick with that plan. My own doubts, second-guessing, and fears about the trip, reflected in the previous week's dreams of confusion and death, soon spun away like water off the smoothly rolling bike wheels. Though there was no water on the road. Blue sky, high 40s, then 50s, in constant view of the quiet high plains, lined by mountains to the east and west. What? Me worry? And behold, cattle crossing the road, driven by 4, cowboys, I guess. The leader here, readying his lariat, wished me a good journey. Antonito, population 750, became a place for brunch, but not for an overnight stay. I was soon on an unlined paved road that would give way to the first of 2 hard-packed dirt roads. Great. They were also going directly west into the 10 to 20 mile an hour headwind. Not so great, but something I'd have to get used to. I would have headwinds for most of my trip, sometimes mild, but later route-changingly strong. Leaving the day's last dirt road, I began the longest climb of the trip. I had thought of staying in one of the federal campsites along the Conejos River, but they were closed until the next week. I could have found a hideaway spot in the national forest, such as here, where I pushed my bike away from the road and took a half-hour break, but the quiet beauty and cool air energized, and I continued on. A trio outside the Red Bear Welcome Center, also closed until the next week, waved and wished me well on the next 4 miles that would take me from their 8,500-foot elevation to the peak. A 500-foot climb, one said. I thought that wasn't bad, thinking of a similar change in half the distance on one of my favorite biking routes at home. It was actually a 1,500-foot climb, but I took my time, taking in the views. And the joy of reaching the top and the 16 miles of downhill to Chama, New Mexico. My first day of biking ended up being twice the distance with more climbing than I thought it might, but it offered plenty of opportunity for 2 of the 4-hour journeys. Rejoicing and reverence. I happily arrived in Chama, New Mexico, a town of 1,000, not counting the tourists and passers-through who might match that number on some days, though not this one. The campground I arrived at had only a few trailers and no other tenters. I happily noted that my tent could be up just in time for a photo of it with the setting sun in the background, like this. But that's a photo I took the next evening. What I got the first evening was this. The little patch of white behind the table is the tent that had well served me for 7 years of bicycling and backpacking. I had stretched out the ground and inserted the poles into the end rings, arced first the one, arced the second one, perhaps happily humming all the while, and with a sharp click, the second one snapped. I looked at it a few seconds. My humming had stopped. It didn't make sense. My trustworthy tent. The first night out. I moved the ground tarp under the shelter and lay my sleeping bag over it. At the end of the trip, I would know that I did not need the tent for protection from rain. There were drops and some cloudy mists, but I did not know that at the time. I did know that nights could get into the 30s and that a wet cold, especially with low energy levels, could be exhausting and even dangerous. While I was considering this, the guy who had heard me talk with the campground owner while checking in came over from his luxury motorhome and asked if I would like to share the taco salad he was making for himself. He said, "My friend and I often stay here and we like to help those who actually work to get here." Wow, sure. Later brought over a large bowl of salad complete with avocados and sour cream. Delicious. The first that I noted anyway, of many kindnesses shown throughout the trip. Before starting on this trip, I had greatly looked forward to being immersed in the natural beauty, but I had not given the slightest thought to interacting with others. I had thought of the trip as a moving hermitage. And this will be reflected in my photos, only 2 of which include people I met. I somewhat regret this. Another thing I would have richly confirmed by the end of this trip, the joy of tasting and sipping divine sacraments is made complete in sharing, in communion. The next morning, I found the campground owner at his gas station and asked him for a piece of cardboard and magic marker to write Albuquerque on one side in large letters and REI in smaller ones, and then on the other side, for the return, Chama. Apart from short distances between trailheads and nearby towns on backpacking trips, I hadn't hitchhiked since university days. But I well knew from those days, including a few cross-country hits, the helpfulness of a sign with destination. Within 10 minutes of holding out the sign, I was picked up. The driver was a 23-year-old who had been working at a ski resort and was moving to Albuquerque. I would realize on the trip back to Chama what dramatic scenery lies between the 2 places, but not now. We quickly became engaged in a delightful philosophical, religious, socio-political discussion that was scarcely with a pause during the 150 miles. It was like he, with his background of Orthodox Judaism, and I, with mine of fundamentalist Christianity, chanted maybe praises of intended good and encouragements to seek truth and beautiful music and fellowship. Many homilies on how biblical Hebrew translation can, as is usually the case, reinforce ideological boundaries or, rarely at a popular level, break them down. Laments for exclusivism in Orthodox or fundamentalists, or now what's called evangelical religion, most acridly exposed in their nationalism and racism. And prayer for communion superseding, if not erasing, in-group, out-group boundaries. In view of his wide scope of learning, cross-cultural experience, fluent self-expression, and empathy, I asked if he considered getting a graduate degree. "You'd be a good teacher." He chuckled. "Well, I'd first have to graduate studies. I'm more or less a sophomore at Yale, but I don't like the atmosphere. I don't do well in the bureaucratic approach of most classes. I might go back, but I'm not sure." As we parted, I thought of the psalm, "Hine ma tov u'manayim, shevet kachim gam yad." How good and pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together. At the REI, I got a $6 pole repair package with a 3-inch splint that would enable me to use the tent for the rest of the trip. It took several hours to hitch out of the Albuquerque area, but I was picked up in the late afternoon by a guy who was passing through Chama for a weekend of soaking in hot springs north of there. This would help him deal with the painful after effects of bacteria invading him while swimming some years ago. He'd had much of these aliens, as he described it, blasted away by acupuncturists and some other kind of doctor with an array of tubes sending out supersonic impulses or something like that. The spa would help ease the residual pain, as had the 2 big ones he'd had before starting the trip. After swerving around a slower car, he veered into politics. "Yeah, the Indians say you shouldn't put a pipeline through there. That's our sacred ancestral land, blah, blah, blah. I say, who gives a shit?" Hopefully my communicated that I did, but did not know if there could be fruitful discussion at this point. I commented about the scenery, and for much of the rest of the ride, he explained the geological processes behind it, and spoke of past joys of canyon hiking and rock climbing, and then of snowboarding and water jet skiing. Well, my tent was back up before dark, and I could continue bicycling the next day, Sunday. The prelude for worship began with early morning light on the mountain viewed from my campsite. The invocation was at an urban-style coffee shop in small-town Chama, where the servers say a happy "all right" to customers' choices and serve mugs full of soul-stirring caffeine. Hymns in my mind, if not on my lips, as I rolled along, were ones of my small rural home church, often of a folk nature. "Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word." Or, "My heavenly home is bright and fair, I feel like traveling on. Nor pain nor death can enter there, I feel like traveling on. Yes, I feel like traveling on. I feel like traveling on. My heavenly home is bright and fair, I feel like traveling on." Brother Kendall on the organ there. Sermons were in the scenery. A state trooper amen with a friendly beat as he passed. The the roadside. I had hoped this day of rest would culminate in a stay on the grounds of Our Lady of the Desert Monastery, but they were closed due to COVID and, to be feared more than the disease itself, the Archbishop's command allowing no wandering stranger to so much as set up his tent on the space dedicated to Benedictine prayer and hospitality. So I biked 45 more miles through fenced-off reservation land to the nearest campground, pushing harder than usual to minimize the amount of nighttime cycling. I dawdled around the campground this morning, doing laundry after a hearty bread and sardines breakfast, then set off for a campground just 20 miles further down the road. A bit hazy from the previous evening's exertion, I was leaving the western outskirts of Farmington, New Mexico, passing by. What did I just see? After a quick debate about doing so, against character, I turned around to go back to this couple. "Hi," I said. "I've traveled quite a bit and seen quite a bit of fresh fruit signs by the side of the road, but never before ammo. Do you mind my taking a picture?" Agreed to my doing so after looking at each other, smiling. The woman replied, "You must not have seen much TV lately." That was certainly true. "Stores can't keep up with the demand." They were nomadic salespersons, often working fairs, festivals, and flea markets. This was a first for them as well. They had been watching TV, purchased the product where they could find it, and brought it to where it could not be found in the stores. "The police have come by twice," one said, "saying they've had complaints about our being here, but they check us out and wish us good luck." And that's what they wished me as I continued down the road. That, folks, is one of my 2 photos with identifiable persons in it. The occasion for another, or for a video clip, would come just down the road, though the participants are now only in mind. I unwittingly passed the road to the campground I'd planned to camp in and continued to Shiprock, a town of 8,000, without campgrounds or motels. In a complex of abandoned municipal buildings, I found an inconspicuous niche hidden from the road, under a tree, against a wall facing an empty parking lot with cones across its entrance on the other side. I was awoken a couple hours later by the sound of a car braking and a spotlight. On the door was Navajo Nation Police. I stood, hands up, and heard a friendly voice greet me and ask how I was doing. I could stay there, he said, but it would be better to stay on the police compound a half-mile down the road. We can be sure no one will bother you there. So I slept well on that peaceful night under a 3/4 moon, my bed of cushion and sleeping bag in the bed of a police pickup truck. Early next morning, in the first hours of biking, I approached and passed Tsebetai, Winged Rock, linked to Navajo legends similar to biblical ones, including people being carried by a giant bird to a new land. This bird then became part of that land, its petrified wings rising above the plains. 19th century newcomers thought the formation looked like a big boat and named it Shiprock. As occurred countless times throughout the West, renaming contributed to outsiders' ignorance of Native American history and culture. It would get worse, as in a name like Devil's Tower, replacing the Dakota name for a sacred place and demonizing it in Christian terms. In the next few hours of biking, I studied other formations and wondered how water from rivers and underground reservoirs has, like the earlier names, been lost to outsiders. A road sign interrupted my observations and musings and made me realize that I had been heading in the wrong direction for quite some time. I was unsure of how to get back on track other than returning to Shiprock and going on from there. The last hours of the morning and the first of the afternoon were spent struggling against the strong headwind to do so. The upside of this was that it prolonged my time on Navajo territory and led to more conversations with some of its members. Some shared my enjoyment of bicycling and told of their favorite spots. Another told me about, say, Bidai and other sacred areas. But another was most concerned about my well-being. He said, "My wife and I saw you out bicycling and would like to help you." And he started to hand me some money. "Oh no, I'm fine." I said, "Please," he said, "take it." Really, I'm okay." "No, please, take it." His outstretched hand did not waver. He said, hesitantly, "And also, you're the first white man we've seen here." Given all the tourists coming through this town, his "here" could not refer to in front of the grocery store where I was, but rather to in this situation, one of weakness and perhaps homelessness. I felt it would be worse to keep refusing a gift of compassion than to accept what I did not need, and in so doing have been further gifted by an enduring, humbling image of this young man's kind compassion for a wayfaring stranger. His folded bill is still in my wallet, a reminder of that family's kindness and encouragement. In Bluff, Utah, a town of about 500 just above the Navajo Nation's northern boundary of the San Juan River, I had a full day of rest, starting with a relaxed breakfast on the front porch of this place, content to sip coffee, soothed by the morning breeze rather than biking against it. Afterwards, I asked the campground manager to suggest a nearby hike. He had been brought up in Bluff after his father, a cop, suddenly moved the family there from L.A. after the election of a new mayor threatened his two-way relationship with the mafia and police force. The manager had loved exploring the canyons and river as a kid and told me of a place just a mile away, only known by local residents. During my hours there, I saw and heard no other person and enjoyed the quieting of mind, body, and soul within that sacred space. To avoid strong headwinds forecast for the next few days, I headed northwest from Bluff rather than taking the southwest route planned before starting the trip. The road out of Bluff had little morning traffic, and I would soon take one having even less. What this road had more of, I would find out as my progress increasingly slowed, was sand. At first, the hard-packed dirt allowed for easy biking and enjoyment of the scenery. But after a few miles, I had to be on the watch for spots of sand where the wheels could swerve out from under me. Then there was nothing but sand, so I spent several hours pushing the bike through it. A distance that would have taken little more than an hour on paved road took most of the day. Tumbleweed tumbled. Rocks stayed firm. It was misty the next morning, but what was in the mist? 3,000 feet lower from where I started that morning, the skies were clearer. Another day to grow in reverence. As I neared Hanksville, Utah, the plains were wider, sandier, and windier. The last 20 miles of the trip, I for the first time had a prolonged tailwind and hardly pedaled at all. My body and bike bags were sails in the 15 to 30 mile an hour wind, with occasional 50 mile an hour gusts giving an extra shove. The wind continuing strong, I took another rest day, biking only to a canyon a couple miles away. That evening, in front of a cabin next to the tenting area, a guy was working on guitar chords for a new song. "Sounds good," I said, walking by. He had a friendly response, and we ended up conversing for a couple hours. An engineer turned management consultant, his ideal week was 3 days of work, 3 days to be outdoors or working on creative projects, and 1 day for laundry and other practicalities. Early next morning, he would be driving out to Goblin Valley State Park and then returning this way. Would I like to go along? Sure. So, the one other photo in this video with an identifiable person in it, and other photos indicating stories shaped by water, wind, stone, and imagination. This unplanned, off-the-route wonderland was like a spiritual dessert in the desert. The feast could continue, but I was feeling sated. The altitudinal peak of my trip was on the first day. The psychological spiritual peaks seemed to be those of the Bluff Hanksville days. There was still plenty of beauty ahead. But at the point of deciding whether to turn south to awesome Bryce Canyon National Park or north toward Salt Lake City, from where I would fly home, I opted for the latter. The paved road to Bryce had considerably more traffic than those of the previous days, and a few miles on the unpaved road to Bryce, along with the talk with those in a four-wheel drive who had been on it, indicated that it would be more difficult and longer than I was up for at that point. The last 3 days of biking would be a transition from rocky splendor and sparse population through farming areas. And the tenseness of dealing with it was fortunately lessened by a wonderful bike path of 50-plus miles leading to Salt Lake City. There, a couple with whom I was put in contact by a mutual friend treated me to a celebratory feast garnished with tales of their bicycling, hikes, mountain climbing, and cave exploring, as well as my own. But typical of this trip, no photo of them. Just this, the bike prepped for the flight home after a wonderful trip. I love to go a-wandering along life's many trails, and as I go, I love to sing a knapsack on my back. Valerie, Valera, Valerie, Valerie, a knapsack